Today I'm going to talk about mercy ships with a couple of disclaimers, and we want to know about the land, mercy ships in this land. But to get there, I have to go back and tell you a little bit more about Don Stevens' story. First, a disclaimer. I want to tell you the parable, which you probably know. It's one of my favorite life reminders of the blind man and the elephant. Once upon a time, and this parable came from the 1st century. Once upon a time, there were some blind men who lived in a tiny, tiny, tiny Indian village, and they probably spent most of their time sitting under a tree begging, and they had very little life experience. This village was not on a cargo route, on a trade route. Nothing much happened in this village, and one day they heard an elephant was coming. They didn't know what an elephant was, so they made their way to where the elephant was really on display because others hadn't seen one either. And the first blind brother felt the side, and the second one felt a leg, and the third one the trunk, and another the floppy ear, and another the tusk, and the last one the tail. And when they went back, as they made their way back, they shared their perception of the elephant. Well, they couldn't agree because each of them had a tiny part. Well, years ago, I had to speak for the first time at Mercy Ships. Really, I thought I was saving a baby's life because she hadn't had surgery on the ship. The doctors had diagnosed her with a rare leukemia, and I had argued with them for months. She had folic acid deficiency, and she left a little fatter, but still at high risk because she couldn't have her lip and palate changed. So I spoke, and I realized before I stood in front of these over 400 people crammed onto the aft deck of the ship that Mercy Ships is like this elephant, and I only knew this little tip of the tail. It was intimidating, and my experience of Mercy Ships to this day is just maybe a tiny thread of the tip of Mercy Ships. So some of you have been in Mercy Ships, different years, different times. Our family was part of Mercy Ships from 1989, the same year the base moved inland here to 2002. So since then, I can't tell you much about it. There are lots of statistics and lots of stories I don't know. But we want to talk about the beginnings. And Don talked about the hurricane that moved him so much. He was raised in Colorado, a farm boy, farm ranch boy. He alluded to having a great family who gave mercy and helps to people who needed it. So he had a good example of character, Christian character in his life, and mercy for others. He was a go-getter, and when I met him, I thought, gosh, this guy is like a world-class businessman. He has all the confidence in the world, and he's really, inapproachable and so on. But he was a strong guy and was going to change the world. And almost by accident, YWAM got a hold of him. He knew about the Peace Corps, and at 19, he joined an SOS. Many of you know that's a summer of service, a YWAM 4-week introduction for teens. We do the SOS now, the STS next door that way. At Youth with Mission, YWAM, the ranch, and we teach kids about the character of God, how to hear God's voice, to pray and ask God if there's a calling on their lives, and it's a basic discipleship, and then show them how to do outreach to others in some form of dance or evangelism. So Don's team, which he described as a faith-based Peace Corps at the onset, went to Nassau in the Bahamas, and there they met Hurricane Cleo, world-famous Hurricane Cleo in 1964. It was one of the 3 biggest hurricanes recorded in history at that time, I think. It decimated a lot of the East Coast and Florida and the Bahamas. So his team of 120 was ushered into the safest building around, a World War II British aircraft hangar. And there I think they learned to pray, really. You can pray and learn to pray, and even from a young age as a child. But when you think you're going to die and know that there's suffering all around you and aren't sure what will happen, I think you really learn to intercede and pray. So they prayed for hours and hours and hours. And intrepid Don, against orders, I'm sure, opened a door at one time, and he saw palm trees toppling, streets flooding, roofs off of dwellings and larger structures, things flying through the air, and was amazed and awed. And at some point in this day, a young woman's prayer came to his ear, and it was, wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a ship with doctors and nurses that could come in after such a disaster? And he remembered that prayer. And he remembered what he'd been reading about the SS Hope, the first non-governmental hospital ship. And on that ship, they did cleft lip and palate surgeries. They went to remote areas wherever they could get the ship and gave aid where there was incredible need, like mothers and babies dying right and left. They started a mother-baby clinic in Brazil. Where's Elizabeth? So I don't know what port they went to, but Elizabeth does. And they did all kinds of things in the years 1960 to 1974. So we're 1964, Don and his girlfriend, Dion Green, who was also raised as a strong Colorado lady with a Christian background, a lady of strong character, went home. Dion received training as a registered nurse in cardiology, and they joined YWAM. I'm not sure about the exact years, but it wasn't too many years before they went to the YWAM Center headquarters near Lausanne, Switzerland. About that time, YWAM, under the direction of Lauren Cunningham, was buying a hotel, and they started training schools called Schools of Evangelism, not the same SOEs that we have now. It was really the discipleship training schools. And that's where we come into the weaving of many relationships. By then, Leland Paris came, and he had a discipleship training school under Lauren Cunningham, the founder of Youth with a Mission, and Don Stevens. And in an aside, he said, well, I didn't get super close with Lauren, but Don and I really, I think he said something like, we're kindred spirits, only whatever a man would say in that instance. It wasn't exactly that. But Don and Leland became friends, and they kept in touch. And remember, at this time, well, I'll go with that in a minute. Don and Dion were appointed directors of YWAM for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And the great thing about this for Don, because he was mulling over bringing mercy into places, thinking about ships in a funny way. Remember, this ranch boy was more comfortable in cowboy boots, and he had never had a cruise. He had never even ridden ferries. But everywhere he went in Europe, he rode ferries, saw boats in the port cities, saw ocean-going vessels. He started subscribing to shipping magazines, started sharing his vision for bringing hope and healing by ship, the YWAM style with mercy, lots of people going into ports. And everywhere he went, he questioned captains and engineers. He got tours when he wasn't going onto the ships and learned what he could about ships and shipping and sailing. At that time, he knew that 95% of the world's largest cities, 95 out of 100 were port cities. And highly populous areas with the highest infant mortality rates, the highest rates of poverty, and the lowest life expectancies in the world. So this brought more and more and more to his mind. During this time, Dion had Heidi, their firstborn, and I called her to get some details on their lives that I couldn't find a few weeks ago. And I said, Dion, I heard that during these years when you guys were leading YWAM for half the world here, you worked as a nurse in Switzerland. She goes, well, actually, Molly, we didn't have enough support. You think of your leaders, and I met them when they did have enough support years later, but you think of them as not having to have the same struggles that we have day to day, or having to count the money. I know when my family was on the ship, Our base crew fee was $438, and when my teen son came for the year and a half he was with us, was an extra $50, and we struggled every month to get that $500 for our room and board fees. And they went through it too. Dion said, no, I took Heidi and went back to Colorado and worked as a nurse twice for 3 months so that we could have support. But also, Molly, I never imagined that our mission season would grow into a lifetime. So this takes us back to these young people who were just in obedience, following God and serving and looking and asking him what would happen the next year and the next year and the next year. So that spoke to their character. That spoke to their struggles with me. So years passed, not too many years, and they had a son, and then a third child, John Paul, he spoke about in this clip. Now, John Paul was obviously disabled, and they weren't sure what was going on for a season. What he doesn't talk about here was Dion had nearly died from acute pancreatitis at the time, and it was a really tough season for them. But they could get medical assessment. Dion recovered, and they finally got the diagnosis that John Paul had autism spectrum disorder, severe autism spectrum disorder, we call it today, and he would never talk or walk. But actually a little miracle happened years later on the ship. They were living on the ship, and Don and Dion had rescued a young woman off the streets of Belgium. They'd actually run into her directly and brought her back to the Anastasis and discipled her personally and then in groups and helped her bring her life together. She'd had a horrible life. She was Gigi and had a strong Belgian accent and threw French words in with her talk and never really learned to speak great English. But we met her as a family after she'd had her own second child. But Gigi was a devoted nanny to John Paul, and she filled in when Don and Dion needed help and worked with John Paul for hours and hours and hours. Well, Gigi fell in love with a fine Australian deckhand named David O'Kane, and they planned to wed. In those days, there wasn't much money, and some people called the Anastasis the love boat because there were 2 or 3 weddings a year from singles who met each other, and so they planned their wedding. And unbeknownst to Don and Dion, Gigi, who was tender and the most loving person I've ever met, always called her children precious, worked to help Jean Paul walk. Well, Don and Dion knew that they had to transfer Jean Paul to go to bed, to get in his wheelchair, to move him anywhere, and he had never done more than 2 steps. But Gigi worked with him and worked with him. And at her wedding, he was a ring bearer, and he walked down the aisle. So that was one miracle for the Stevens family. So back to Lausanne, in the wake of John Paul's birth, when he was quite young, they were dealing with how are we going to be missionaries? How are we going to get him the help we can need? What's going on? And they had some friends in YWAM, Switzerland, who were Swiss. They were the Andres. I don't know if that was a first or last name, but Don confided in Mr. Andre, but he also shared his ship vision and his desire to bring mercy, to bring hope and healing to the nations with ships, and how he was trying to figure out how to buy a ship, and on and on and on. And finally, Andre, he must have been a humble, quiet man, said, well, Don, I can put you in touch with some people who could help you find a ship. And Don said, oh, really? And he said, yes, my family owns ships. they were shipping magnates in Europe, and Andre had just never mentioned his background. So Andre helped Don find a couple of shipping agents, and they began to look for the right kind of ship to bring hope and healing to the nations. So he had a support team. Lauren Cunningham was on board. He had prayer warriors and those who helped him, and they found a couple of ships. And Sue alluded to the first ship that Mercy Ships or YWAM bought to become a Mercy Ships, and that was the Maori. And everything worked out perfectly. They found the perfect ship. But Don had a nightmare one night because everyone is ecstatic to have the ship, that in the throes of their excitement over having a ship, they had put Jesus off to the side, and they were idolizing this instrument of mercy. And I can see that we often tend to do that. That was a beautiful ship here that I got to live on for so many years, and people would say, "Oh, you're in mercy ships. Do you live on a ship?" Ships, because it sounds exciting, but we have to remember Jesus. So Don himself said, "I think we have to give the ship back. I think we have to lay down our dream, and we really need to repent and ask God, if this is his vision, then to resurrect it in his timing." And some of them weren't too happy about this, but they finally agreed with him, and they gave up on the ship. I don't know how much longer it was. It wasn't that many years before he got a call from a shipping agent, and there was a very special passenger cargo luxury liner that laid abandoned or sat abandoned in Venice, Italy. It was the MV Victoria, and it was unique because the Italian government had made it with an extra thick steel hull. And I guess they made all of the liners for their country in this era in 1953. And it sailed for many years, and then it had been abandoned. Abandoned with food on the tables, beds half made, things just akimbo when it stopped making a profit, when the company no longer could run it for a profit. So Don and his team camped out and saw the ship, loved it, and you saw in the pictures, she was a beautiful ship. She had a very beautiful line that you don't see anymore, because those kind of beautiful passenger cargo vessels tend to move in the water when it's stormy. It means if you have a refrigerator or a child, you have to tie them down if you're in the Bay of Biscay. But she was a beautiful ship. And the newer ships have the flatter bottoms. If you look at the Africa Mercy, she was bigger in capacity. She was a Danish ferry with a roll-on, roll-off capacity, meaning we didn't have to crane our cargo and our cars up and off the ship. And she didn't move as much. So they found the ship. And they began negotiation with an old Italian businessman, and at first the price was $4 million, and they couldn't afford it, and they kept saying, "Well, are you sure you're not going to use the ship?" and on, and I guess the man looked at how tenacious these people were, and these funny people camped out in a campground, which was not the norm in Venice, Italy, I guess. I haven't been there. And he finally said, "I want to do something in my life. I'm getting old, and before I die, I want to do something that will make a difference. So I'll sell you this ship for $1 million. Well, $1 million was like about $20 million to them, but they got a down payment together. And then the neat thing happened. YWAMers all over the world, Christians who knew about them, gave their widow's mites to get this $1 million together. Some of the YWAM bases who had bought their properties mortgaged them, and the ones that already had a mortgage managed to second mortgage these YWAM bases. So they got the $1 million together and paid for the ship in short order. So July 7th, 1978, I remember because it's our wedding anniversary, they had the ship towed to Greece to a ship graveyard to work on. And that was just the beginning of a 4-year odyssey or ordeal, depending on whether your glass is half full or half empty. But it was tough going. People worked day and night to get the ship in order. But a miracle happened fairly soon after they began to clean up the debris and all the old food and junk in the ship. They found some equipment. Roland might remember what it was. In one of the holds, and it at first looked like it was parts for a ship like the Anastasis or something, but it turned out to be nothing related, to the MV Victoria. It was nothing related to the ship. They were able to sell these parts, metal, whatever it was, for $1.2 million and pay off all the widows who had contributed and redeem all the YWAM bases that were in hock for this ship, and also purchase a little more diesel and keep their refit of the ship going. And this time they only had power 1 hour in the morning and 1 hour at night, because it took diesel fuel to power their generators, and they would go truck into wherever the diesel gas station was and get 55 gallons of diesel, and that would operate the ship's generators for an hour in the morning and an hour at night. And our first crew physician, Chris Aroni, a woman you might know, Cheryl Mackey, who was a nurse at the time. She's a counselor who lives in Van now. And Ruth Crow, another nurse who has been or was with Mercy Ships for many, many years, worked learning to needle gun and scrape the rust off of decks and basically made a hospital ward and helped get the operating rooms, the one-day operating rooms ready, hours and hours and hours on end. They prayed to bring in people who had the technical skills. They really stayed close to God, thankfully, at every step, and He provided the workers, the volunteers, and enough food to keep them going. During that time, there were miracles I won't go into. You can read about fish jumping out of the ocean and the relationships with the Greek people there online. It's just incredible, but God provided miracles to keep them going that most of us may not have had in our lives. Incredible things happened, but it was 4 years, and exactly 4 years from the date they bought the MV Victoria. She had her maiden voyage, now rechristened the MV Anastasis, meaning resurrection. And she sailed to Malta, the island of Malta, where she was given the Maltese cross flag. And there's some history with that flag. The cross flew over a band of men or pirates or someone who were godly people at one point. So there's a spiritual history to that. Somebody like Carrie or Roland can maybe tell you about that history, but it's God's guiding and God, putting His cross over the ship. So we always had the Maltese cross over us to remind us it was His ship. So the ship sailed that July, but you will remember from history about Last Days Ministry and Keith Green that July of 1982 was the same month that he died in the plane crash. And I want to tell you a little aside about my husband, how he got involved with Mercy Ships, because Keith Green was an awesome supporter of YWAM and Mercy Ships. So I was asking Kurt again last week, I said, so how was it you heard about Mercy Ships? How was it? And he said, well, I had been discipled in this group, and then I went back home to farm country, ranch country, Tulare County in California, and I tore out this huge acres and acres of almond trees, and we cut up the wood, and we sold the wood, and I had just so much money, and I didn't know what to do with it. I kept asking the Lord, what do I do with this money? And I never went to concerts, but I went to this concert, and Keith Green talked about YWAM and the ship that was to come, and I felt the Lord say, you're supposed to do that. And he said, so he called up a couple months later, and they were all ready to sign him up for the first DTS ever on board the Anastasis. So tragically, Keith died, but Kurt got the word from him directly via God that he was to join the Anastasis. So my husband boarded that DTS, and it had 100, depending on who you listen to. Kurt says 100. Another friend, Helen Mass, says 160 students in a discipleship training school. And those of you who might have been around YWAM know that they like to have groups of 20 or 30 or little groups to disciple, but they needed crew. They needed housekeepers. They needed people that could work in the engine rooms. They needed people to man the mooring ropes, and they were teaching them outright right then as they sailed. So this discipleship training school did their first relief mission with the MV Anastasis to Guatemala. There had been a hurricane some months before in El Salvador, Guatemala, and so they brought relief goods there. I don't know what all they did. I wasn't there, but it was an incredibly life-changing time. According to Kurt, Mike Maddox, and a few of the other people I know who were on the ship, they were learning as they went. So they sailed from Guatemala, stopped in Tahiti, went to New Zealand. Now, you all know New Zealand is a boating, shipping island. And so they had a lot of support in New Zealand. By then, there was Mercy Ships New Zealand starting already. And so they recruited crew, cargo, and went on their way to the South Seas Islands. So that was the beginning of the Mercy Ships ministry In subsequent years, they went to Mexico. I don't know where all they went. And obviously in 1989, when the base was moving here, they were on the video in Jamaica. So that's where we come back here. So there had already been some forward-thinking YWAMers who joined Mercy Ships, and they thought we would need a base in California, and that's where the ship had sailed from in 1982. But 10 or 12 people started a base, the first Mercy Ships U.S. base in San Pedro, California. That's the huge San Pedro Harbor, which is now considered part of Los Angeles, as Los Angeles has grown. And even in the 80s, that harbor was one of the busiest in the United States and one of the most profitable, and to this day does a lot of cargo and supply running. But it also has a spiritual history, which is kind of cool. The first people recorded to see this San Pedro Harbor were Spanish sailors who brought monks, and as early as 1582 were supplying these monks and trading with the monks who inhabited this part of what's now Southern California, but was then Spanish territory. So I'm thinking it was a very spiritual area for our first U.S. base. The base began to outgrow its office space in these years of the 80s as the Anastasis, our flagship, was doing its first missions. Meanwhile, Don and Dion had become fast friends with Leland and Fran Paris, and by then they were here. Dave Wilkerson had opened up property for them. So Don and Dion in their visits had gotten to know Tony Salerno, Dave Wilkerson, obviously, Winky Pratney, and Leonard Ravenhill. And one visit in end of 1984, Don and Dion stayed on the boardwalk at Youth with a Mission next door, Twin Oaks Ranch. And if you haven't seen Twin Oaks Ranch, you can go over to the substation and get a coffee or have a sandwich and have somebody give you a little tour, a little history. It's just a basic, wonderful base, but Don and Dion and probably a couple of their kids were staying on the boardwalk, and Tony Salerno asked for a meeting. He wanted Leland and Don and Winky Pratney and Brother Dave, and I'm not sure, but possibly Leonard Ravenhill, the big wigs, these men of vision who were just obedient, ordinary guys who had inhabited our special land to come and pray. And Tony told them that we're going to have to sell the Agape Force Ranch. And they prayed and prayed and prayed over the land, and the consensus was, of course, they wanted this land next door. Am I pointing the right way? To bring God glory, to bring glory to God, to be his land again. Well, it was sold in 1985. Looked like all was a go for God to be glorified. A.C. Musgrave, a local, wonderful Christian man who lives here, bought the property and leased it to Bethany Bible College. They had some other satellite colleges. Basically, I think they were, at that time, Dallas-Fort Worth based. Bethany Bible College operated on the Mercy Ships on the Agape Force property for 2 semesters, but there were too many buildings to keep up. There was too much money needed, and they gave it back. And I don't know exactly if they gave it back to A.C. Musgrave, because it's a little known fact that he bought it. I think he likes to have a secret or two now and then, but Bert told me about this. Or he gave it back to the bank, or anyway, it sold again in 1987 to a secular, for-profit organization called New Medico. Now, New Medico was known for having big rehab operations, and this base property was used for neurological patients. They would live there and have extensive therapy there. So as neuro patients, they needed ramps and roll-in bathrooms and wheelchair access, and New Medico had the money. So they kept up the buildings, they refitted them for the less abled, and kept the property beautifully, but they ceased to make a profit after a few years. and then they went bankrupt. What I didn't tell you about that prayer time that I just have to tell you is after the prayer meeting, Don Stevens went back to the boardwalk, and Dion, of course, how was the prayer meeting? And he said, oh, you're going to think I'm crazy. Well, I know that he said that to her many times in the early years. When you live with a visionary man, he probably says, you're going to think I'm crazy. But I believe the Lord said this property is for mercy ships. So she wrote it in her journal and dated it, and that was very interesting. So New Mexico eventually, where are my dates here? And gave the property to the bank, and Mercy Ships was eventually able to buy it. In the meantime, Mercy Ships had already moved here. Mercy Ships had an offer that they couldn't refuse from Dave Wilkerson. We couldn't afford office space in this high-end Los Angeles San Pedro harbor. So Leland wanted Mercy Ships here, Dawn in the ministry here, and Dave Wilkerson had property that he wasn't using actively, and that was the warehouse property that you might have seen on the way into town. I'm probably pointing the wrong way again. On the way into town from Van, on the right-hand side, there's a little for sale sign there, but there's a long straight driveway and a warehouse, a couple of offices adjacent to it, and that was the first part of the property. But it was kind of broken up into several places, totaling 5 houses, and one of which was Dave Wilkerson's private residence, just before he lease optioned it to buy for us. And every day, they came in September 1989, probably 30 people by then, headed up by Jack and Sherry Minton and an operations officer named Jeff Neese. And it was hot, and it was different, and it was a new culture for these people, many of them California coastal kind of people. But they made a base here out of these disparate properties. So in the one property was where we had supplies and collected medical supplies mostly. The procurement, donor services, and the medical department were in those offices at the warehouse. And then down at Dave Wilkerson's house was administration and the beginnings of marine operations. The women stayed in a house down another driveway, and so on. So every day, we came, I have to tell you that. We came October 7th, so a few weeks later, after the first pioneers, by accident, when the base was still in San Pedro, they had accepted us to be a family on the flagship, the Anastasis. So we thought we were just coming through to pick up papers, but the family that was in our cabin hadn't moved out. It turned out they were the one family we had supported for 6 years, and Kurt's best friend, Bill Pease, and his family were leaving the ship, and we were going to be moving into their cabin. But we stopped, and it was a hot Saturday, and we drove down that driveway, and no one was there. We had an old motor home. We'd sold everything, and we'd been traveling for about a month, saying goodbye, raising support, and so hot day. My baby girl's second birthday, and we were kind of miserable, but Ben tumbled out of this motor home and just rolled around on this green grass because he was a little stir crazy. And about 10 minutes later, we realized that he was screaming, and he had met fire ants, and he had 50 bites on his tummy. So this is what was so good about this area, this land. It was very different, but we drove back to Van trying to find some Mercy Ship people because no one was around. And the old Smith Pharmacy was in the strip mall where I think it's a pizza parlor is now, and the old Brookshire's was there too. And Mr. Smith, or the pharmacist, whoever he was in Smith's Pharmacy, introduced us to fire ants, told us how to treat them, and told us where to find the other Mercy Shipper, because you guys must be a Mercy Shipper. You look like those Mercy Shipper people. Introduced us to Jeff Neese, and he got us parked in a trailer park. And so a few days later, we were allowed to park behind the old duplexes that Mercy Ships leased for some of the staff, and we plugged into the last duplex in kind of an icky field behind it, and I got to use the bathtub. It was a Norwegian couple, and he was one of the first kind of maritime people. You know, Norwegians are great maritime people. I don't remember their names, I just remember their graciousness, because we would use their house. We would use their little tiny 1-bedroom for the bathtub and other things, and they were so kind to us. And they just had a little towhead, very like your hair, a little 2-year-old boy and beautiful blonde mom, and then this jolly, dark Norwegian guy. He was such a nice man. So we stayed there, and I worked on the base when I could. Anna napping on the couch in her diaper because it was very, very hot, record heat for October. And every day at lunch, everyone from all the buildings assembled in the Wilkerson house. And you walked in, and it was office desks on the left, and the smell of hazelnut coffee. And we had gotten a donation of several hundred pounds of hazelnut coffee, and everyone drank hazelnut coffee all day long to this day. And that's been it's been 29 years in a couple months. I cannot stand the taste, smell of hazelnut coffee or creamer. So no offense if you offer me it in your home, give me water. So we walk in, there was a couple of tables. We'd have a lunch. There were a few enough of us that are kids, and we could all get together and pray and have announcements and then go our separate ways after that. But once a week, we had the community meeting like we used to have, and I didn't realize how blessed we were. We had Dave Wilkerson when he was in town. We had Winky Pratney. We had Leland. We had Leonard Ravenhill. We had all these people, even the ones that didn't talk very often came. And by then there was a lot of speakers like Dean Sherman and people that had been speaking to YWAM bases, and they all wanted to see why, against all logic, mercy ships had come inland 250 miles from the port and what we could possibly do in here. But they spoke to us, and we got a lot of good teaching in this little chapel room where you could fit maybe 30 chairs, where there was a beautiful stained glass window. Dave Wilkerson had a stained glass window in his house. But he also had gold faucets, because I would wash the kids' hands in a little guest bathroom with gold faucets. So that was the beginning. That was 1989. In the subsequent years, as New Medico, I didn't mention this last night, as New Medico began to lose money, they actually rented mercy ships, 30 acres in the middle of the base, so we could expand for our discipleship training schools and use a few offices. But we didn't buy the property until, drum roll please while I look for it. Okay. 1995, and we were able to buy the property for pennies on the dollar, and not long after that, Dion told us in an evening meeting that she read us her journal entry and said, well, the Lord spoke to Don 11 years ago that this was supposed to be Mercy Ship's property. So, 2001, we added a huge warehouse, because our warehouse is actually what would have been our warehouse was the warehouse school area from Agape Force. That's the sanctuary here now. So we built a warehouse up next door. And then 2009, that was 7,000 square feet. In 2009, we added another 8,000 square feet. So huge, huge warehouse and a lot of offices to meet Mercy Ship's expanding needs. But I guess what was amazing to me is that God knew all along that this property would come to us, and this property totally worked for the ministry of mercy ships. We have had other ships during this time and other ports of call and other areas of ministry, but less to do with the west coast of the United States, less ports and less ministry that could effectively grow out of San Pedro. It turned out that our Gulf port 250 miles away worked better for shipping to all over the world where we were going, to the African outreaches and so on. And it also turned out that staff and crew could fly in better to Texas than to one coast or the other. So we saw God's provision in all of this. I forgot to tell you one other thing about our lives. I wasn't so impressed at the time, but thinking back on it, Dave Wilkerson made it possible for us to be here, and he made it possible for YWAM to be at their base. And then when we went to church, it was the church and van, in a storefront and van. It was the Wilkerson Church, and they embraced us, whether we were Mercy Ships or YWAM or what. And somebody sold us a car for $100. And one week, a guy walked up to Kurt. They talked for a few minutes. The next Sunday, he said, well, yeah, I know you live in this motorhome. Would you mind living with me? And we went, what? And he said, well, I'm only there on the weekends with my children now. It's on a lake. His name was Jay Tomlin. It was Tomlin Lake in Lindale. And it was, we need to stop. Yeah, it was about a 4-bedroom, 2-bath. So God provided a house from this other world challenge person. And the first Thanksgiving we were there, Melody Green invited the entire base, 50 of us in total for Thanksgiving. So I saw the unity of the base and the unity of this place. I had thought of it like football teams, different ministries like competing football teams, but really we were coming to a place where the foundations were already made and there was unity in all these ministries so we could all be stronger. And so that's the blessing. I want to say one thing about Dion, what she said to me on the phone. I said, oh, Dion, when I talked to her to get these facts straight, I said, it's so neat to hear about this and to talk about this. And she goes, yes, Molly, it's great to tell about our stories, but the challenge is to make new stories. And I took that as my personal challenge, and I put that to us. It's not just a challenge to pray for our children and our grandchildren, but we are challenged. But the challenge is for each of us to continue our story or find our new stories, no matter what our age or what's going on in our lives.